Frank Lucas said he was smarter than every cop in New York. But there was one detective he didn't count on. A man who refused bribes, who couldn't be bought, who wouldn't look the other way. And that man destroyed everything Frank had built. His name was Richie Roberts. And in 1970s New York, he was an anomaly. A cop who turned down money. It started with $987,000 in cash. Nearly $1 million sitting in the trunk of a car tied to the mob. Most cops would have kept it, split it, made it disappear. Richie Roberts turned it in, every single dollar. His fellow officers thought he was crazy. Some thought he was dangerous, because an honest cop makes the dirty ones look bad. They stopped trusting him, stopped backing him up on calls. His own department treated him like a rat. But Roberts didn't care about being liked. He cared about the law, and in 1975, he got a case that would define his career. A drug dealer named Frank Lucas. The man who claimed he owned Harlem. The man who said he was untouchable. Roberts was going to prove him wrong. Frank Lucas wasn't like other drug dealers. He was smart, disciplined, calculated. He didn't flaunt his wealth. Until he did. 1971. The fight of the century. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden. Frank Lucas walked in wearing a $100,000 chinchilla fur coat. Front row seats, cameras everywhere, flashbulbs popping. And Richie Roberts was watching. Not in person, but later. In photos, in newspapers. Roberts knew something was wrong. This guy, Frank Lucas, wasn't on anyone's radar. No major arrests, no FBI file, nothing. But he's sitting ringside in a coat worth more than most people's houses? Roberts started digging. He pulled records, talked to informants, followed the money. And what he found was an empire. Frank Lucas wasn't just dealing heroin. He was importing it directly from Southeast Asia. Cutting out the Italian mob, undercutting their prices, flooding Harlem with a product so pure it was killing people faster than anything else on the street. He called it blue magic. And it was everywhere. But here's the thing about empires built on secrecy. One mistake. One moment of pride. And it all comes crashing down. That fur coat. That was the mistake. Roberts built his case slowly. Surveillance. Wiretaps. Informants. He tracked Frank's operation for months. Every shipment. Every payment. Every dirty cop on Frank's payroll. Because that was the other problem. Frank Lucas had bought half the NYPD, detectives, captains, even some federal agents. They warned him when raids were coming. They looked the other way when shipments arrived. Frank thought he was protected. But Richie Roberts? He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. Not his department, not his partners, nobody. Because he knew if word got out, Frank would disappear. So Roberts worked alone, built the case in secret. And on January 28, 1975, he made his move. Federal agents raided Frank Lucas's operation in Teaneck, New Jersey. They found heroin, cash, weapons. Enough evidence to put Frank away for life. Frank Lucas was arrested, handcuffed, charged with conspiracy to distribute narcotics. The man who said he owned Harlem was going to prison. But the story doesn't end there. Frank Lucas was facing 70 years in prison. 70 years. For a man in his 40s, that was a death sentence. So Frank did what he'd always done. He played the game. He made a deal. Frank Lucas became an informant. He gave up names. Over 100 corrupt cops and criminals. Detectives who'd been taking bribes for years. Federal agents who'd been protecting shipments. Even some of the Italian mobsters he'd worked with. Frank snitched on everyone. And in exchange, his sentence was reduced. 70 years became 15. Then 5. 5 years for building an empire that destroyed thousands of lives. Richie Roberts? He was disgusted. He'd spent years building the case, risking his career, his safety. And Frank Lucas walked out of prison in 1981. Free man. But here's what most people don't know. Frank Lucas lied about almost everything. The coffins? The story about smuggling heroin in the caskets of dead American soldiers? Some investigators say it never happened. The empire? It wasn't as big as Frank claimed. The respect from the Italian mob? Exaggerated. Frank Lucas built his legend on lies. He told his story to a reporter. That story became an article. The article became a movie, American Gangster starring Denzel Washington. And suddenly, Frank Lucas was a folk hero. But Richie Roberts knew the truth. Frank wasn't a genius. He was a drug dealer who got lucky and snitched when he got caught. The real story isn't about power. It's about what happens when pride outweighs intelligence. Frank Lucas wore that fur coat because he wanted to be seen. And being seen got him caught. Richie Roberts didn't need a fur coat. He didn't need recognition. He just needed to do his job. And that's why he won. So here's the lesson. Real power isn't about flash. It's not about being the loudest person in the room. Real power is patience, discipline, and knowing when to stay quiet. Frank Lucas forgot that. And it cost him everything. If this story showed you a side of Frank Lucas you'd never heard before, hit that subscribe button. Because next week, we're uncovering the truth about another criminal legend that Hollywood got completely wrong. See you in the next one.